Hi everyone, Barbara Rankin here today with another ColourArte video creator tutorial for you. Now, I was going through my stash and I came across this little box of embellishments I had made years and years and years ago. And I was using simple packaging from a box that something I ordered had come in. And I cut them up into, I believe these are 2-inch squares. And yep, they are. And this one I saw, this one is a little bit bigger, possibly 4 by 4. No, this is 3 by 3. And it looks a little, what's the word, dull. But I think it could be rejuvenated. It is something I made using the Ranger melting pot with the clear embossing powder, otherwise known as UT, ultra thick embossing enamel. And back in those days we were having a lot of fun with that melting pot. I still have mine and I might bring it out sometime and show you what I used to do with it. But here's one that I made where I stamped an image into it and I used the UT, but it looks like I also added lots of different colors of embossing enamel in there. And this one here, this one was stamped on a layer beneath, and then the clear UT was added over it with little sprinkle things. So it actually has a lot of depth to it. Let's see if I can. It almost looks like it's floating in there. This one, it looks like I used color and then I came back with clear on the top, and I probably stamped into it with, I would have had gold ink on my stamp. Here's another one that's similar. I used the same stamp for this one. This one I stamped on top of the clear embossing enamel. And you can actually feel the texture of this one. Let's see if I can see if you can see the texture. It's really hard to capture it on. There we go. On these cameras here. There. That's good. And then this last one, this is probably my favorite, mostly because it looks like a verdigris, which I love anything that looks metallic or like real metal. This one I would have been using UT just to make, to save my colored embossing powders, and applied gold embossing powder on top, just sprinkle some on top to color it. And then it looks like I also used a verdigris embossing powder, just sprinkled very randomly. And when it was melted, then I came back with this pretty stamp and stamped into it. So once again, I got a really nice texture. This is absolutely my favorite here. You can see the texture there. There we go. And you know, some techniques are just timeless, and I think this is one of them. Now today I wanted to try something with my ColourArte paints and see what I can come up with. So I wanted to show you first of all how the best way to cut nice straight lines with your craft knife to make nice crisp squares to embellish. So let me set this aside and I'll grab my craft knife and we'll get started. So I'll finish cutting a few of these and then we'll get started. The next thing we need to do is prime each piece. For that I'm going to be using white gesso. I'm using Liquitex, but you can use whatever you have on hand. First we want to get some texture on the backgrounds. For a couple I'm going to use this Wendy Vecchi Crackled texture paste I have on hand. Mine's a little dry, but it still works. Next I'm going to use this stencil from Crafter's Workshop. It is 554S Mini Butterfly Collage. S Mini Butterfly Collage. You'll want to choose small stencils with smaller openings since our tiles are so small. I'm using my golden light molding paste, and I'll spread the paste through portions of the stencil with a spatula, and then I'll set the piece aside to dry. Also, you'll want to clean your stencil really well. You don't want that paste to dry inside those little openings. For my next tile, I'm going to add a bit thicker layer of the light molding paste, about 1/8 inch thick or so, and I'm going to try to get it as smooth as I can. I want it to dry with a skin on it, but not completely dry underneath. If you're careful, you can use your heat tool to speed it up, but be mindful not to overheat it and make it dry hard or cause bubbles in the paste. When you can touch it and it feels dry, but just slightly squishy underneath, grab a stamp that's about the same size as the tile. I chose this pretty clear stamp, so I need to put it onto an acrylic block. Line it up with the edges of the cardboard and press into the almost dried paste. When you remove the stamp, there shouldn't be any paste stuck to your stamp, and you should have a nice imprint. Set the piece aside to dry completely. Okay, we've got 2 more tiles left. For this one, I've chosen this stamp from the set. It looks like peonies, and I've already attached it to my acrylic block. I have here an anti-static pouch that I'll rub over the tile to make the embossing powder stick to the ink better. So first I'm inking the stamp with clear embossing ink. Then I'll stamp the image over the tile, centering it as best as possible. After that, I'll dip it into my gold embossing powder, and then I'll use my heat tool to heat the powder until it becomes shiny. For the last one, I'm simply going to glue a couple of small pieces of torn book pages to the tile using matte medium. Be sure to cover the papers with the matte medium too, so you'll have a nice protective coating over them when you're adding your paints. You can use your heat tool to speed that drying time too. When that's dry, I'm just adding a whitewash over the book pages to knock them back into the background. Working on the tile that I had spread with molding paste and stamped into, I'm painting it with 2 coats of Peaceful Poppy Vivid Ultrametallics. On the 2 tiles that I put crackle paste, I'm going to base coat them with Burnt Umber Vivid Ultrametallics. You can either use a wet brush to thin it or mist it with water after applying it directly from the bottle. And then I'm just going to set them aside to dry naturally. Next, I'm going to base coat the stamped and embossed tile with pink Azalea Vivid, and then I'll let this dry naturally too. I'm going to use Teal Zircon Vivid Ultrametallic to base coat the tile that we use the stencil on. And for the last tile, I'm just going to base coat that with the Ocean Wave Vivid Ultrametallic. While this first coat is drying, which isn't going to take very long, I'm going to cut a ragged piece of this mesh wallboard tape and adhere it to the top of the tile. Now I'm using my finger to add a second, slightly thicker coat of Vivid. I'll set this aside to dry too. Now back to the red tile. I want to bring out the stamped image, so I'm going to be dabbing Solar Gold Radiant Rain over the surface. After adding the gold, I started to remove some of the excess gold on the high spots, but I decided to dry it some first. Then I came back with a soft towel and buffed the gold off the high spots to reveal the beautiful red color. I think this is my favorite one so far. On the blue tile, I want to add some word texture. So I have this tiny word stamp that I'll ink up with my black archival ink and stamp tiny bits of it randomly over the surface and dry it well. Next, I'll grab my Mystic Blue Vivid Ultra Metallic and I'll use my finger to dab some color randomly over the tile. This is a really neat effect, and you'll want to dry it well. Next, I'm going to use my Bronze Medallion primary elements to bring out the stenciled images. I just pick up the powder with my finger and rub it across the high spots. These powders will rub off, however, if you don't use something to prevent that, but I'll show you that in a bit. Remember the pink tile we stamped the peonies on and then gold embossed it? But after painting it, we lost some of that detail. I have iridescent red primary elements here that I'm going to apply with a pointed cosmetic cotton swab. It is perfect for getting the powdered pigment in these smaller areas. Once again, these will rub off unless I do something, so I'm going to flood the surface with a coat of 3D crystal lacquer. You can also use glossy accents for this. So this is my 3D crystal lacquer. I've decanted it from this larger jar and put it into the smaller one. But you can also use your glossy accents as well. So I like to start at the edge and work my way towards the center. Do not shake the bottle because it will cause air bubbles. And if you do get any air bubbles, you can use a straight pin to poke them and they will disappear. This stuff is self-leveling and dries crystal clear like a resin, but easier to use and water-based. And now I'm going to cover and protect the powder I rubbed over the stenciling on the blue tile. When you're done, set them aside and let them dry for several hours at least. Do not be tempted to touch them with your finger to see if they are dry. You will surely regret it. Don't even ask me how I know it. So once again, I'm going to grab some Kiwi Vivid Ultrametallic and use my finger to randomly dab the color over the background. But this time, before it dries, I'm going to add some tiny glitz to the piece. The really cool thing is that there are tiny gold beads in the mix, and whatever doesn't stick to the wet paint is being captured temporarily by the mesh tape I laid down. Okay, I've let the paint dry, and so now I'm going to take my 3D crystal lacquer once again and encapsulate everything on top, even those beads that didn't stick. Okay, now for the last two, these were the first ones we did with the crackle paste and the burnt umber vivid. And I want to add just a little more orange to it. And so, or coppery look. This is True Metals Autumn Flame. And I'm just going to dab some of this color over the background where I think it needs help. Sorry, I didn't notice the camera wasn't focusing, but I'm using the same technique as before. Now that the top coat is dried, I decided to use some of my Tim Holtz Ideology metals for these. I'm simply using the 3D crystal lacquer to adhere them, and then I'll flood the entire surface again with the lacquer. Now I'll need to set this aside for a while to let it dry, as this layer is quite a bit thicker than the previous pieces. Now I'm going to try something I hope works, but I've never done it before, and I can think of a million reasons why it might fail, but here goes. I want to bring back the stamped image on the pink tile, so I'm adding some anti-static powder to the surface so the embossing powder won't stick to the paint. Then I'm inking the stamp with Versamark, and since the stamp is clear, I should be able to see through it well enough to come close to lining it up again. Now, I will need to use the heat gun to emboss the gold powder, but I'll need to be careful doing that so I don't heat the lacquer and possibly cause bubbles. Now, I've sped the video up during the heating process, so bear in mind I spent several minutes trying to heat the embossing powder. But as it turns out, the lacquer started bubbling before I could get the embossing powder to melt. But it was hot enough for the embossing powder to stick, so I quit heating it, and then I'll just flood the piece with lacquer again. We'll take a closer look after it dries. Now, here's the pink one, and that top coat of lacquer has dried, but you can still see, let me see if I can get a close-up. You can still see on this edge where I got some bubbling, and I can actually feel it. It's a cool texture if that's what you're going for, but not necessarily something you want. So there are things you can do to that. One I thought of immediately was a linear type of embellishment along the edge, maybe. This was, found that first. This one I really like, this idea of just finding a couple of metal corners and gluing them to the edge. And then this one doesn't actually need it, but it looks really pretty on there nonetheless. Maybe smaller corners would be nice. But the nice thing is you can see a little better the stamped image in there, which is pretty cool looking. But like I said, I'm going to leave these until I actually use them to determine what, if anything, I'm going to put on top to further embellish the layer. That actually looks like a cool, something neat. So you could put these on a canvas and do something with them. Okay, so that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed my project, and I'm going to make a new series. I'm going to call it Making Your Own Embellishments. And I hope you'll come back and follow me on this journey and see what I come up with. Thanks for your support, and thanks so much for watching. Have a great day. For more inspiration, you can find me on these social media links. If you enjoyed today's project video, please give me a thumbs up, and I hope you will consider subscribing to my channel. Thanks for watching, and always take time to play.